Across human history, few sounds have carried such weight, such resonance, such mystery as the toll of a bell. Before the modern world filled our ears with machinery and traffic, the bell was the sound that defined both heaven and earth. Its deep bronze voice pierced silence, reached across valleys, echoed through cities, and carried meaning beyond words. For centuries, it was not only a signal of faith, but the rhythm of life itself, a voice that marked joy and sorrow, birth and death, peace and danger. And yet there was a time when Christianity knew no such sound, when its gatherings were marked only by whispers, footsteps, and the knocking of wood. In the earliest days of the church, the air was filled with silence. The faithful were called together, not by bronze, but by the cry of a neighbor, the hand of a messenger, or the thud of a wooden plank struck with a mallet. This was the semantron, the humble forerunner of the bell, its hollow sound echoing through courtyards and cloisters. It summoned monks from their sleep, it carried across the valleys, it kept rhythm in places where no clock existed. But its voice was dull, a blunt knock rather than a song, and though it served, it did not soar. The people longed for a sound that felt like heaven itself, a sound that rose like incense into the skies. It was then, legend tells, that Paulinus of Nola dreamed. One night he saw a dazzling light descend, and within the light came a vibration unlike any he had ever known. It was strong and metallic, yet soft with warmth, a voice that seemed to awaken the soul itself. When he awoke, he sought to capture it in the world of men. He ordered craftsmen to shape bronze into instruments that could ring with the voice of heaven, and he hung these bells in the churches of his city. Whether the story is fact or legend, its power remains. Even the word campana, the Latin for bell, remembers the land of Campania where Paulinus lived. Language itself whispers the memory of that first ringing. At first, the bells were small. They could be carried in processions, lifted with one arm, rung with a single pull of rope. And yet they had a presence greater than their size. To the villagers who heard them, they were more than metal. They were a call to gather, a summons to prayer, a cry of alarm, a proclamation of joy. For those who could not read, who owned no calendar, who measured time only by the sun and seasons, the bell became a clock in the air. Its tone told them when to rise, when to rest, when to pray, when to mourn. Nowhere did this sound shape life more deeply than in the monasteries. Benedict of Nursia, father of the Western monastic rule, demanded that monks pray at fixed hours through the day and night, matins in the darkness before dawn, lauds as the sun rose, prime in the morning, sext at midday, vespers at dusk, compline at night. But in a world without mechanical clocks, how could such order be kept? The bell became the keeper of time. Its call in the silence of midnight pulled brothers from their beds. Its toll at dawn marked the rising of the world. Its voice at noon and evening set the rhythm of their devotion. Slowly, the life of the monastery spilled outward into the life of the village. Farmers and shepherds began to live by the bell as well, and soon the sound became the rhythm of entire communities. Yet the bell was never only practical. From the beginning, it carried an aura of mystery. People came to believe that its vibrations drove away demons, scattered storms, purified the air. Chronicles tell of lightning breaking apart after a bell was struck, of witches fleeing its tones, of the devil himself silenced by its cry. Priests began to bless bells in elaborate rituals. They sprinkled them with holy water, anointed them with oil, wrapped them in incense smoke. Some were given names, baptized as though they had souls of their own. To strike a bell was no longer to make noise. It was to release a consecrated voice, a weapon of heaven against the powers of darkness. By the 8th and 9th centuries, bells had grown. They were no longer small instruments of wood and rope, but giants of bronze, weighing hundreds of kilograms. Churches raised towers to lift them high above the fields, so that their voices would travel far across the land. Imagine a shepherd at dawn, guiding his flock through misty pastures. The world is quiet, the grass heavy with dew, and then, from miles away, a deep tone rolls across the hill and trembles through the earth, through his body, through his soul. Without seeing the church, he knows it is time to pray. Without reading a calendar, he knows the feast has begun. Without hearing a word, he knows the voice of heaven has spoken. The bell had become more than metal. It was memory and presence, joy and warning, heartbeat and breath. It bound a community together in sound. It marked the rhythm of the sacred and the ordinary alike. By the dawn of the Middle Ages, Europe was no longer silent. From towers of stone, the voices of bronze rose into the skies. They marked time, they claimed space, they sanctified the very air. To live within their sound was to live within the embrace of the Church. And what began as a whisper in Nola was now becoming a thunder that would shake cathedrals, cities, and nations for centuries to come. By the time the Middle Ages unfolded, the quiet whisper of the early Church had become a thunder rolling across Europe. The bell was no longer a modest tool hanging from wooden beams. It had become the voice of entire cities, the sound that ruled time and sanctified life. As stone cathedrals rose into the skies with their soaring spires and flying buttresses, they carried not only the weight of faith, but the weight of bronze. Towers were built not only to touch heaven, but to house bells so massive that their ringing shook the stones themselves. When such a bell rang, the whole city trembled. The streets emptied, the markets paused, the faithful lifted their eyes. Travelers on distant roads would hear the booming peals before they ever saw the city's walls. For them, the sound was reassurance. Here stood a place of God. Here stood a community held together by a voice that reached farther than any human tongue. To approach a medieval town was to approach a soundscape of bronze, a symphony of towers calling out across the land. The bell became more than a summons to prayer. It became the law of time. At dawn, it called the Angelus, a moment when peasants paused in their fields to bow their heads, whispering prayers as the mist lifted from the earth. At noon, it rang again, marking not only an hour of devotion but a moment for markets to open, for courts to begin their sessions, for townsfolk to measure their days. At evening, its voice rolled once more, a call for prayer and a warning that curfew was near. To live within earshot of a bell tower was to live under the order of sound. And yet this order was never without emotion. Bells carried the seasons of the soul. They pealed in wild joy on Easter morning, tumbling over one another like laughter. They tolled slow and heavy when death struck, each measured strike like the beat of a mourning heart. In times of marriage, their tones rang bright and clear, while during plague years, their deep groans spread dread through the streets, announcing loss after loss. The people needed no proclamations. They only had to listen. The bells told them who had died, who had wed, who was born, who was buried. The power of the bell was not confined to the sacred. Rulers, too, bent their authority to its voice. Kings commanded bells to be rung at coronations. Cities rang them to announce charters. Armies marched to their rhythms. A bell could declare war as surely as it could declare mass. It could summon men to arms as easily as it could summon monks to prayer. In some towns, the great communal bell, hung in the heart of the city, was seen as the voice of the people themselves. When it rang, the citizens gathered, decisions were made, justice was demanded. To silence such a bell was to silence the very will of the community. But always behind the political and the practical lay the sense of the mystical. To the medieval imagination, the bell was not merely sound, but spirit. When storms threatened, bells were rung frantically to chase away thunderclouds. Some were even inscribed with prayers or images of saints, as if the bronze itself could command the sky. Farmers swore that the peal of a consecrated bell could drive locusts from the fields or heal sickness in the air. Demons were said to flee before its toll, and angels to draw near. In these centuries of fear and faith, the bell was a shield as much as a song. And so the bell became not only the heartbeat of a city, but the voice of heaven, echoing through stone and air. No one escaped its sound. The noble in his hall, the monk in his cloister, the peasant in his field, all heard the same toll, all paused at the same moments, all lived under the same rhythm. It was the unifying force of medieval life, binding heaven and earth with every strike of its clapper. Imagine the streets of Paris in the 13th century. Notre Dame's towers loom above the city, and within them hang bells of such size that men must strain with ropes to move them. When they ring, the Seine itself seems to tremble. Across the rooftops, the sound rolls, through the narrow alleys, over the markets, out into the fields. It is not just a sound, it is a presence. It is God's breath moving through bronze. Thus, in the Middle Ages, the bell ruled both time and soul. It commanded the hours, sanctified the days, announced the turning of life and death. It was both the most ordinary sound heard every day, at every hour, and the most extraordinary, carrying mystery, awe, and power. To hear it was to be reminded that one lived in a world where heaven was never far away, where the unseen pressed close, where the voice of bronze connected earth to eternity. The voice of the bell was never only the measure of time. To the medieval soul, it was far more than bronze and clapper. It was mystery, protection, even magic. Each toll carried invisible power. Each vibration shook not only the air but the unseen world. When people heard its rolling voice, they believed that heaven itself was speaking, and that dark forces were driven away in fear. In countless villages, when storm clouds gathered and thunder threatened to split the sky, the bells were rung. Priests hurried into the towers, pulling at the ropes with urgency, their arms aching as the bronze shook above them. The sound rolled outward, deep and insistent, meant to tear the clouds apart, to scatter lightning, to command the winds to be still. And people swore it worked. They told stories of storms breaking suddenly, of lightning diverted from church towers, of crops saved from ruin because the bell's voice had cut through the fury of the heavens. For them, it was not coincidence. It was proof that the bell was more than an instrument. It was a shield, forged not only of bronze, but of faith. The same voice was believed to scatter demons. Darkness could not withstand the sound. Witches, it was said, could not perform their spells under the toll of a bell. Spirits that wandered the earth at night fled from its vibrations. When death approached, bells were rung to keep evil away from the departing soul. The slow toll of the passing bell was both an announcement and a defense, warning the living to pray and guarding the dead from the grasp of the devil. Because of this, bells themselves were consecrated in ceremonies as elaborate as baptisms. They were sprinkled with holy water, anointed with sacred oil, perfumed with incense. Bishops spoke over them as if they were children receiving a soul. They were given names, often the names of saints or holy figures, and once consecrated, they were treated as sacred beings. To strike them was to unleash sanctity, to awaken their voice as a weapon of light. Some bells even bore inscriptions in Latin, prayers engraved in bronze, words meant to echo with every toll, summoning divine protection. In this way, the bell stood at the border between the natural and the supernatural. Its sound was physical, a vibration of air, yet it carried meanings that went beyond the senses. To the ear, it was a tone. To the heart, it was reassurance. To the spirit, it was power. The bell tower itself became a kind of fortress, not only of stone, but of sound, rising above the village as a watchman against storms and spirits alike. And people grew attached to their bells as if to living companions. Stories spread of bells that refused to ring when misused, or that cracked in sorrow at the death of a beloved king. Some were said to ring of their own accord in times of crisis, as if the bronze itself felt the grief of the people. Villagers kissed their bells during festivals, touched them as if they were relics, prayed before them when danger loomed. In their minds, the bell was not a tool. It was a voice of God, a guardian spirit, that watched over the community. Imagine a dark night in a small medieval town. A storm gathers, winds howl, and people huddle in their homes, candles flickering. Then suddenly the bell begins to toll, its deep vibrations rise above the storm, rolling through the streets, over rooftops, into the fields. Mothers clutch their children, men cross themselves, prayers are whispered. The storm still rages, but the sound steadies their hearts. It is the assurance that they are not abandoned, that heaven still speaks, that the darkness cannot prevail. Thus the bell became the link between earth and sky, between the human and the divine. Its sound sanctified the air, defended the soul, scattered the shadows. It was the breath of faith cast into metal, a constant reminder that in every storm, in every night, in every moment of fear, there was a voice that rose above it all, a voice that belonged not to men, but to God. Across Europe, the sound of bells filled every corner, yet not every community heard them in the same way, for while all Christians shared the conviction that the bell was more than metal, that its voice carried heaven into the air, each tradition clothed the sound with its own spirit. In the Latin West, the Catholic Church gave the bell the dignity of sacramentals, consecrated objects filled with grace. In the East, the Orthodox Church wove bells into a fabric of rhythm and polyphony, their voices mingling like choirs in bronze. And in the lands of the Reformation, Protestant simplicity reshaped the bell into a leaner, sparer voice, stripped of mystery, yet still resonant with community. In Catholic lands, bells were almost persons in their own right. Their baptisms were celebrated with pomp, priests lifting their hands in blessing, sprinkling holy water, anointing with chrism oil, speaking the words of sanctification as if over a child. Once baptized, the bell had a soul of sorts. It was named, revered, sometimes even recorded in chronicles as though it were a figure of history. Villagers believed their bell knew them, protected them, watched over them. When it rang, it was not merely bronze in motion, but a saint calling out, a guardian spirit warning and consoling. Great bells like Emmanuel of Notre Dame or Maria Gloriosa of Erfurt became legendary, their tones said to move men to tears, their voices thought to be unlike any other sound on earth. The Orthodox world told a different story. In the East, bells were not baptized, but they sang in choruses. Russian towers rang with dozens of bells, some small as a hand, some great as a room, each tuned to a different pitch. Together they did not play melodies in the Western sense, but patterns of sound, cascades of tones falling over one another, weaving texture into the air. To stand beneath a Russian bell tower as it rang was to be enveloped in waves, struck not by a single call but by a storm of bronze voices. For the Orthodox imagination, this was not the voice of one angel, but the chorus of many, a sound that mirrored the harmony of heaven itself. The rhythms marked feasts and fasts, weddings and funerals, always with patterns distinct enough that the people knew instantly what was being proclaimed. The bells were not solitary heralds, but choirs, singing to God. When the Reformation came, the bell's story took yet another turn. Protestant reformers stripped churches of much of their ornament and ritual, seeking a purer, simpler worship. Many of the old consecrations were rejected, the baptisms of bells dismissed as superstition. Yet even reformers did not silence them entirely, for the bell was too deeply woven into the life of towns and villages to be discarded. Instead, it was pared down, its role shifted from mystical protector to practical herald. In Protestant towns, the bell still marked hours of worship, still called people to gather, still tolled at funerals, but without the elaborate rites of blessing, without the layers of sacred symbolism. It became the voice of community rather than the voice of heaven, and yet even then, when its deep tone rolled across the rooftops, people still felt the solemn weight of eternity in its sound. These differences painted the soundscape of Europe with many colors. In one land, a single mighty bell tolled with sacred authority. In another, a chorus of bells cascaded in polyphony. In another, a spare and sober peal carried across the air. But all shared the conviction that life could not be lived without bells. They ordered days, sanctified seasons, bound the people into one body. Catholic, Orthodox, or Protestant, no Christian lived untouched by their voice. They were the thread that tied villages to monasteries, cities to cathedrals, men to God. And though the words spoken about them differed, the experience was shared. The bell was always more than sound. It was belonging. It was memory. It was the mark of a people who lived not only by bread and labor, but by a voice that spoke from beyond the earth, a voice that echoed in the air, in the stone, in the soul. The bell was never only the keeper of prayer or the herald of worship. It was the voice of the people themselves, a voice that carried through joy and sorrow, through peace and chaos, through the long shadows of history. When armies marched, when plagues spread, when rulers rose and fell, the bell was there, sounding across the landscape like the very heartbeat of a community. To hear it was to know not only the hour of the day, but the mood of the age. In times of war, the bell was a sentinel. Its frantic ringing echoed like alarm, calling men from fields and workshops, summoning them to defend their homes. Villages that might otherwise have been caught unawares were awakened by its urgent clamor. The tones rolled across hills and rivers, warning of approaching armies, announcing the siege, telling every ear within reach that danger had come. Soldiers marched to its beat, and generals used it as a signal to rally their troops. Sometimes the very presence of the bell became a symbol of defiance. In besieged towns, when food ran short and walls cracked, the people still rang their bells, proclaiming to enemy and ally alike that they were not yet broken. But war also threatened the bells themselves. Invaders silenced towers, looted bells, melted them into cannons. The bronze that once called men to prayer was recast into weapons of destruction. Yet even when transformed, people remembered the origin of the metal. A cannon forged from a stolen bell carried an irony. A voice that had once prayed for peace now spoke in thunder of war. And when peace returned, communities mourned their lost bells as if they were beloved dead, raising money to cast new ones, naming them, blessing them, rejoicing when their voices returned to the sky. In times of plague, the bell tolled differently. It was slow, heavy, measured, each strike falling like a heartbeat of grief. Across the 14th century, as the Black Death swept through towns and villages, bells tolled day after day, hour after hour, announcing the endless passing of souls. The sound became the soundtrack of despair, the constant reminder of death's shadow, yet it was also a call to prayer, a plea for mercy, a signal that the living should kneel and intercede for the dying. In some places, the tolling became so constant that people said the air itself grew heavy with sorrow, as though the bronze had soaked up the grief of the world. Even in less apocalyptic times, the bell was the announcer of mortality. The death knell tolled at the passing of every soul, its rhythm sometimes coded to tell whether the departed was a man, a woman, or a child. To hear it was to be reminded of one's own fragility, to pause and whisper a prayer, to know that the community shared in every loss. The bell did not allow death to pass in silence. It gave voice to grief, binding the living together in mourning. But the bell did not only ring for fear. It rang for celebration too, and in such moments it became pure joy. At coronations, its peals shook the skies as kings were crowned. At victories, it rang triumphant, announcing that the city had survived, that God had blessed their arms. At weddings, its tones cascaded like laughter, echoing the joy of the crowd. Each life event, each communal moment, was marked in bronze. The people did not need written records. Their ears remembered. The bells themselves became the archive of their joys and sorrows. In many cities, the great communal bell was the voice of the people's power. When it rang, citizens gathered in the square to deliberate, to protest, to demand justice. Its sound could summon thousands, its silence could speak of oppression. To control the bell was to control the city. Kings and princes understood this, and so they sometimes silenced bells to stifle rebellion or remove them altogether. But again and again the people reclaimed them, for the bell was theirs. It was the soul of the community cast in bronze. Through all these moments, war and plague, feast and mourning, rebellion and coronation, the bell carried memory. Generations passed, rulers changed, but the bell's voice remained. Its sound became the soundtrack of centuries, echoing in the minds of all who lived within its reach. To hear it was to feel history itself vibrating in the air. The bell was not only the keeper of time, it was the keeper of memory, the voice that told each community who they were, what they had endured, what they celebrated, what they mourned. Imagine a medieval city at dusk. The market is closed, soldiers stand guard at the gates, torches flicker in the streets. Suddenly, the bell begins to toll. Its slow, steady rhythm carries through every alley, every rooftop. Families pause at their tables, children fall silent. The sound tells them that one of their own has died. And though many may not know the name, all share the moment. The bell makes their grief communal, their silence one. In that sound, the city breathes, as one body, one soul. Such was the power of the bell in the memory of Christendom. It was the voice of alarm and the voice of hope, the cry of warning and the laugh of celebration. It was history itself, cast in bronze, rung in sorrow, rung in joy, always there, always speaking, always reminding the people that their lives were woven together, not only by blood and work, but by the tolling of a voice that belonged to them all. As the Middle Ages gave way to the Age of Light and rebirth, the sound of the bell did not fade. It simply found new voices, new meanings, new places in the world. The Renaissance brought with it a hunger for harmony, proportion, and beauty, and bells too became part of this unfolding vision. Their shapes were refined, their inscriptions grew more elaborate, their towers more daring. They were no longer only the sentinels of faith, they became instruments of art. In paintings, bells appeared as symbols of devotion and eternity. Artists portrayed them gleaming in towers, casting long shadows across towns, or glimmering at dawn as light broke over stone. In music, composers imitated their tones, layering voices and instruments to capture the solemnity of their peals. Even poetry echoed with their resonance, for the toll of a bell could symbolize the passage of time, the brevity of life, or the hope of resurrection. The bell became not only heard but imagined, a motif that lived in the mind as much as in the ear. But as Europe transformed, so too did the role of the bell. The mechanical clock was born, first in monasteries and then in town squares, and with it came a new master of time. Towers that once rang only with bells now housed great clock faces, their hands cutting through hours with silent precision. Yet the bell was not displaced. Instead, it joined with the clock, its tones marking the hours for all who could not read the dial. The marriage of bronze and mechanism created a new rhythm for life, sight and sound together, steel and stone, binding the day into ordered portions. The Industrial Revolution changed the world again. Factories rose, smokestacks pierced the sky, and new sounds filled the air. The hiss of steam, the clatter of machines, the whistle of trains. Against this growing roar, the old bronze voices sometimes seemed faint. Yet they endured. Church towers still tolled on Sundays, still rang in weddings and funerals, still pealed in celebration when peace treaties were signed or rulers crowned. In the midst of machines, the bell remained the sound of continuity, the echo of tradition in a world hurtling toward modernity. And yet something subtle shifted. Where once the bell had ruled time itself, now the factory whistle and the pocket watch claimed that authority. Time became more precise, less sacred, more mechanical. The bell no longer measured every moment of the day, it measured the sacred moments, the ones beyond industry, the ones that reminded people of their souls. It ceded the practical to clocks, but kept the spiritual. Its voice no longer told men when to sow or reap, but it still told them when to kneel, when to rejoice, when to mourn. Still, the bell could not be silenced from the great events of the age. During revolutions, its tones proclaimed freedom or rang as warnings of terror. During wars, bells were again melted into canon, only to be recast when peace returned, their new voices brighter, their tones deeper, as though history itself had reshaped them. Some became national treasures, symbols of identity, their sound recognized as the voice of a people. Imagine a European city in the 19th century. Smoke hangs over the rooftops. Carriages rattle on cobblestones, the hum of factories fills the streets, and then, rising above it all, a bell begins to toll. Its resonance cuts through the noise, its vibrations stronger than iron wheels and steam engines. People pause, look upward, remember, for in that sound lies not the industry of men, but the eternity of heaven, the unbroken chain of centuries. Thus, through the Renaissance and into the modern age, the bell remained, transformed but unforgotten. Once the ruler of time, it had become the guardian of meaning. Once the herald of every hour, it had become the voice of the sacred hour. Its tones were fewer now, but when they came they mattered more. They reminded a busy, changing world that beyond the turning of gears and the smoke of engines, there was still the eternal rhythm, still the voice that had carried through valleys, cities, and centuries. The voice of bronze, speaking of heaven to earth. In the world of today, where the air is filled with the hum of engines, the pulse of electricity, the ceaseless chatter of voices carried through wires and screens, the bell still rings. Its voice is rarer, sometimes softer, often competing with the roar of modern life, yet when it sounds, it cuts through all else. It carries not as a command over time, but as a reminder of continuity, a memory of the centuries when it ruled the hours of humanity. In Rome, the Vatican bells still ring above the city, their tones echoing across St. Peter's Square, drawing pilgrims from around the world. The deep resonance of those bronze voices reminds the faithful that they stand in the heart of Catholic tradition, in the shadow of a church that has heard bells for over 1,000 years. At great moments, papal elections, canonizations, Christmas midnight mass, their sound is broadcast across nations, a reminder that in the age of satellites and digital streams, the voice of bronze still matters. In the Orthodox world, bells continue to thunder with polyphonic power. Russian towers still ring cascades of tones, each festival marked by its own rhythm, each holy day announced with its own bronze chorus. To stand beneath such a tower even now is to feel the weight of history, to be enveloped in waves of sound that seem older than nations, older even than language. For the Orthodox faithful, bells remain more than tradition. They are prayer made audible, heaven woven into air. Even in Protestant lands, where the symbolism is more restrained, bells still ring on Sundays, still toll for weddings and funerals, still mark moments of national grief or celebration. They may no longer be baptized or given saints' names, but their presence endures. The great bells of Britain ring across London on New Year's Eve, their sound broadcast to millions who wait for midnight. In America, bells mark Independence Day and memorial ceremonies. The secular has not silenced them, it has merely given them new occasions. Beyond religion, bells now belong also to culture. They draw tourists who marvel at their size, their age, their voices. Famous bells, Big Ben in London, the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia, the Great Bourdon of Notre Dame, have become symbols not only of faith, but of cities, nations' identities. People who no longer pray still pause to listen, still feel a stirring when the bronze tolls across the air. The sound belongs to humanity now, not only to the church. And yet the world has changed. Many modern bells are electronic, their tones recorded and played through speakers, imitations of the old resonance. For some, these are enough. For others, they lack the soul of true bronze. The vibration of metal cast by human hands, consecrated by centuries of faith, cannot be fully replaced by circuits. In the digital age, the bell risks becoming a symbol rather than a presence. But perhaps even symbols matter, for they remind us of what once was, and of what might still be. Still, there are moments when the bell reclaims its ancient power. On the anniversaries of great tragedies, bells toll in silence across nations, each strike echoing through television broadcasts, through crowded squares, through living rooms where people bow their heads. At weddings and coronations, their joyful peals still declare hope and renewal. At funerals of leaders, their deep tolls still proclaim the passing of history. In those moments, the world remembers. The noise of machines falls away, the endless digital chatter pauses, and the voice of bronze rises again, unchallenged. Imagine standing in a modern city square, the streets alive with cars, screens glowing on every wall, people rushing with phones in their hands. And then, suddenly, a bell begins to toll. The sound gathers above the rooftops, cuts through traffic, makes heads turn. For an instant, time itself seems to slow. People remember that beyond their devices, beyond the speed of their lives, there is still a rhythm older than machines, still a voice that has spoken for centuries, still a call that belongs to both earth and heaven. So the bell endures, not as ruler of hours, but as keeper of memory, not as master of time, but as guardian of meaning. It rings across cathedrals and city halls, across villages and vast capitals, across faith and culture alike. It may be fewer now, its tones less constant, but when it speaks, the world listens. For the toll of a bell is more than sound. It is history, faith, memory, eternity. And even in the digital age, when its bronze voice rises, it still carries the same mystery it always did, the voice of heaven echoing in the air of earth. The toll of a bell is never just sound. It is vibration that enters not only the air but the body, a trembling that reaches the heart, a voice that seems to speak from somewhere beyond. Across centuries, it has ruled the hours of men, called them to prayer, warned them of danger, carried their joys, and mourned their dead. It has thundered above cities and whispered across valleys, echoed in cathedrals of stone, and in the smallest village chapels. Its voice has been cast into canons and recast into peace, silenced by tyrants and reclaimed by the people, feared by demons and cherished by saints. To tell the story of the bell is to tell the story of humanity listening for something greater than itself. From the first whispers of bronze in Nola to the thunder of Gothic towers, from the frantic alarms of war to the slow tolls of plague, from coronations to funerals, from medieval villages to modern capitals, the bell has been more than a sound, it has been memory. It carried faith across generations who could not read, who knew no clocks, who measured their days by the rising and setting of the sun. It spoke to them of God, of community, of life's fragile passage. It told them that they were not alone, that their joys and sorrows were shared, that heaven's voice was near. Even now, when machines and screens fill the air with endless noise, when time is measured by digital numbers, the toll of a bell can still cut through everything. It can still silence a crowd, still bring a city to pause, still make hearts turn inward. Its tones may be rarer, but they are no less powerful. They remind us of continuity, of belonging, of mystery. They remind us that we are bound not only to the present moment, but to the long chain of voices that came before. Imagine hearing a bell at dusk. The sky is dimming, the world is busy, and yet the sound rises, slow and solemn. Each strike is like a heartbeat, steady and sure. In that moment, you are connected to centuries of men and women who once stopped their work at the same sound, who once bowed their heads, who once whispered prayers. You are connected to shepherds in medieval fields, to monks in stone cloisters, to townsfolk gathered in squares, to kings in palaces, to children lulled to sleep by distant chimes. The bell does not belong to one age, it belongs to them all. And perhaps this is why its mystery endures. For the bell is not only about God or church or nation, it is about the human longing for a voice beyond our own. We strike bronze and hear something that seems not to come from us at all. We hear the echo of eternity, the breath of heaven, the reminder that life is more than the hours we measure, more than the noise we make. We hear a sound that tells us of beginnings and endings, of joy and sorrow, of time and timelessness. So even as the world changes, the bell still matters. It may be rung less often, it may compete with engines and sirens and speakers, but when it speaks, it still carries weight, resonance, mystery. It still tells us who we are, where we have been, and what we are reaching for. It is the voice that has sanctified silence, the heartbeat of centuries, the memory of faith cast in bronze. And when it tolls, whether in the Vatican or in a village tower, whether in celebration or in mourning, whether in ritual or in remembrance, it still does what it has always done. It calls us to listen, to remember, to hope. For across human history, no sound has carried such weight, such resonance, such mystery as the toll of a bell.